Welcome to Committing Faith in Public, a podcast for people who want to be inspired by individuals and communities of faith, working for a more just, kind, and hospitable society. Through the stories our guests tell, we want to encourage you to commit your faith in public too. I'm Gary Peluso-Verdend, Executive Director of the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Welcome to Committing Faith in Public, and I'm very pleased to be on today with, I won't say an old friend of mine, but I just did, but somebody I've known now for a fairly long time, well over 20 years, Charisa Hunter-Crump, the Reverend Dr. Charisa Hunter-Crump. She and I first met when she was pastoring a small church in Denver, and I think I did a retreat up at the retreat house in Evergreen, Colorado, and Conifer, Colorado. And then Charisa, who's a graduate of Iliff School of Theology, did a Doctor of Ministry degree at Phillips Theological Seminary. Charisa is, in my estimate, one of the preachers I like listening to on a regular basis. I'm always impressed with the way you use words. And her family, she's not the only preacher in her family. Her family is known as being kind of Anglo-Catholic disciples. And Charisa has a strong poetic sense. She adds to that also a strong sense of congregations need to be involved in a community and for social justice. So first, welcome, Charisa. It's so good to see you. Even though on the podcast you won't be able to see us, but we see each other as we're doing this. And welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Gary. I'm so glad to be here.
What I wanted to talk to Charisa about is a religious congregation's experience during the pandemic and sort of what they've learned from it. And as we're moving out of lockdowns and face masking and other sorts of things now, and back to in-person, sort of what may be changed along the way. So first, for the sake of the folks listening, tell us a little about the church you serve, Cairn Christian Church near Boulder, Colorado, and Lafayette, Colorado, and its journey from its former home to where it is now.
Well, it's a great story because we are one of those very old historic churches, almost 150 years old. We were actually founded before Colorado became a state, and moved through lots of transitions within the Boulder community, but eventually built a building there in the 1960s that was very forward-thinking, very modern, very beautiful, facing the Flatirons, just sort of an amazing space. And they finally, as so many churches did in that era, had to let that building go. And it became unmanageable with a smaller congregation. And so we needed to move. They actually called me to ministry the month that they were moving. So they had already started selling the building. They had already purchased a new building, which happens to be a Orthodox building built in about the 1980s, about 10 miles east in Lafayette, Colorado. And so they had to leave that building. They had to leave their community. They had to leave all of the ministries that they had worked so hard to establish there. And we made that 10-mile journey, literally walked from the old building to the new building, packed. During worship, we packed all of our sacred objects into backpacks, and we literally carried them the 10 miles from one location to the next. And then when we got to the new building, we drank milk and honey on the front lawn to celebrate reaching our new home. But it was just a huge transition to leave that place and basically become a new church start in a new community.
Right. And what were the missional reasons for choosing the place you did?
So some of the reasons that we chose it were purely practical. We found a building we could afford. It was beautiful.
That's no small thing.
That's no small thing. But the other reality is there was no progressive church voice at that point in that eastern part of Boulder County. So there was a brand new opportunity to be that progressive voice in a new community, and we were very excited about that. The other piece of it is that it was a growing community. And so there were opportunities for growth in the community. And then the other thing is we really were a church made up of people that came from all different places, precisely because we had a progressive voice and were involved in social justice. And so people were traveling from Denver and from Longmont, north of us. And so the Lafayette position gave us much more opportunities for our community to be centrally located for all the folks that were coming in.
And it's surprising to hear that there weren't other, at that time, established progressive church voices in the area, because when I hear Boulder, I initially, I think University of Colorado and one of the most liberal, and if not a liberal, not only liberal, but kind of secular kinds of environments. Yeah. So it's just surprising that there wasn't just a bunch of progressive ministries around.
Right. And there are so many more now. I mean, as Boulder has become, it's sort of landlocked. Boulder, you can't do anything in Boulder anymore. And so people are moving out into these communities outside. Yeah. And so that sort of progressive bubble that exists there in Boulder, and it is definitely a bubble, that has expanded out into those areas now. But really, we were on the front end of it.
So has the church benefited from that expanded bubble?
Definitely. I would say definitely. And as with any church, we've had highs and lows, but we have seen tremendous growth in our membership. We have been able to reach out to communities that had nowhere really to go and worship, in particular the LGBTQ community in East Boulder. And we've really thrived in that new situation. And again, so all those things that were so hard to leave behind because they had worked so hard to establish them, they were very brave and bold to make that decision.
Sounds that way, yes. Yeah, that's admirable. So, year ago March, the world changed for those of us used to so much face-to-face and interpersonal. And I know that I've been to Cairn once to preach, and I can tell it's a tight-knit community, and people really value their face-to-face, in-person interaction. But a year ago March, all that changed. In what ways was Cairn well prepared in any, if any, for that kind of change, for the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, was anybody in any way prepared for the pandemic?
Well prepared, right, more or less.
But I think what we were prepared for was change itself. And I think there's a number of things to think about on that. For one thing, we had the new building we're in now is our fourth building. So every time this congregation has seen the situation change for themselves, they've been willing to say, it's time for another move. It's time for something new.
Right. The church is not the building.
The church is not the building. And I also think that they have really tried to move with the changes in social needs and to really address those as those things have come up, and they've addressed them. They've addressed homelessness within the Boulder community for years and years, and hosting ministries, feeding folks with a community table in their basement many nights of the week. They have tried to be flexible around worship and change with those needs. We've done major work as a community on the new sanctuary movement and trying to understand what that is.
In case people don't know what that is, tell us what New Sanctuary Movement is.
So the sanctuary movement back in the 80s was that willingness to house folks that otherwise were going to be deported. And there was a lot of danger around that. There's been a new movement that particularly picked up steam under the Trump administration, but also under Obama when immigration, the rules around it were so broken, and folks that were just your ordinary families being separated from each other and deported. And so churches would set themselves up as sanctuary churches to take them in and let them live in their property, because those spaces were off limits for deportation. And so we went through a year-long process of addressing whether we could become a sanctuary church. And it was pretty controversial among our membership, even with how progressive and what their views were. So we ended up being a support church. We didn't house anyone, but we've supported Ingrid Encolada de la Torre. For 4 years, she has been in sanctuary. So just making those big decisions, we've had to do that through the years. And I also think our structure lends itself. We had, when we restructured after we moved into the new building, we created what we call a visioning team. And the visioning team specifically looks at what's next. So they don't pay any attention to the details or micromanaging. They take the long view of what are we missing? What opportunities are there? What do we need to get better at doing? And so we have that built into our structure to try and meet an immediate need as it comes up. So I think in all those ways, we were ready as you could be. And I also think we had done the work on technology.
Tell me some about that.
When we remodeled our sanctuary, so that was one of the first things we did, because an Orthodox church is set up very differently, and so
right.
So there was a lot that needed to happen to make the.
There was I've never heard of an iconostasis in a disciples' church, right?
and once they took all their accoutrements out, it was a very plain space.
Okay,
and so when we did that remodel, we incorporated technology into it. And this had been a church that, with all their progressive ideas, were very resistant to any technology. And I think primarily because it reminded them of a megachurch or a more evangelical style worship, and they wanted nothing to do with it. But we incorporated that in. We put 2 screens in our sanctuary. We tried to do it very aesthetically pleasing and to use them in ways that really did enhance our sacred space and our sense of what worship was. And so we already were incorporating music and images and those kinds of things into our worship. So that was fairly easy to transfer over to a Zoom format.
I can say that.
Yeah. And then we had used Zoom some as a congregation for meetings, but really not much. It was a big, steep learning curve for us to all do that. But within 2 weeks of the start of the pandemic, so we did 2 weeks with no worship. I just sent emails out to the congregation each Sunday. But within that 2 weeks, we had put together our Zoom worship and transferred everything over and trained all of our membership with the help of our elders in how to use Zoom, held several training sessions, and within 2 weeks we had that up and running. So I also think just amazing leadership that knew because we'd faced so many decisions together over the 10 years and the years before that, we were ready to make quick decisions.
Besides the learning curve and using Zoom for everything, were there other learning curves, at least one other learning curve that you really felt, the congregation really leaned into and embraced that one?
I think it had to do with, so one of the things that is, like you've already said, we are a very close-knit, intimate congregation. And how do you put that online? So, right, you can produce something beautiful, but how do you make it intimate? And how do you do that in a way that's safe online? So we're a very intergenerational church. And so our worship services involve all of our kids, all of our youth. They do things every Sunday, not just, feeding them a children's sermon, but actually having them leave worship, be part of worship. And we share our joys and concerns every Sunday and have this open time of sharing. Now, how do you put that out in a public space? It's one of the reasons we've never streamed our worship services, because they really, it's not a performance. It's a gathering of who we are together.
And it changed when we know that even from seminary worship and all here, it's a whole lot of different decisions.
Yeah.
When, you have a joys and concerns time that in the more private space of a sanctuary means one thing. Once you put it online, then you have perhaps a violation of all kinds of HIPAA codes and
Yes.
confidences and the like.
I think that's also another way we were very prepared for the pandemic, is that we had a comprehensive safety policy in place, that all the decisions about what goes online and what does not, those were made. Now, we've actually improved those over the year as we've learned more and more, but we were ready for those kinds of decisions about putting our children's images. We put no children's images anywhere online. And but that learning curve of how to be intimate and still in worship. And it's why we chose Zoom and not streaming. And it has been remarkable what we've been able to do to keep those connections. And all we do is we edit all of that out before it ever goes on to anything online. So trying to remember the question that I'm answering.
Well, it was about a learning curve that you leaned into as a congregation, really learned something from. And I want to underline what you're saying about the safety factor and about some of those really important decisions of streaming versus playing a recording of some sort, or leaving as the artifact being left behind, being that recording where you had an opportunity to edit it and make sure that this was safe for everyone. I think that was really, that's something I want to underline here.
And the other one that I think of is, and I'm focusing on worship, but I think the other one is, we're a tactile church. We're a sensory church. And so our worship is not just visual and auditory. It's so much more than that. And what did it look like to create that using Zoom? So we use seasonal teams. So each season they create the theme, they create the space, the sacred space around that theme, and they create the liturgy. So every season looks different. And so our summer seasonal team was the first team to do that during pandemic. And they came up with, and there's probably other churches that have done exactly this idea, but they came up with the idea of worship bags that we then delivered to every household in our community. And in those worship bags, so every season since then has done that. They've included candles. We've had rocks for building cairns, paper chains that we've made. We've included implements for doing Lectio Visio. So we've really been able to include the tactile in those. And so I think that was a learning curve. It was sort of like, how on earth do we do this and create this?
The tactile part. Yeah, interesting. Thinking in the level of ecclesiology, of what it means to be the church, be church, do church, is something I know that you give some attention to. And I'd really like to hear, did you learn something about doing or being church that you might not have on a gut level really known previously?
What if it's something that I sort of knew on a gut level and then it just sort of confirmed it?
Oh, okay. That's also, I'm happy for that revision. Go for it.
Because we've mentioned the buildings and that the church is not the building. And it really has been phenomenal in some ways, Zoom has offered us something. We talk about trying to be a safe space to be brave. It's not our language. It's language that we just have incorporated. But a safe space that we can ask questions, learn together, say things that might be controversial, challenge each other about our faith or about a social justice issue. So we talk about safe space and brave space a lot. In some ways, Zoom has allowed a little bit more safety, especially for folks that may be joining us for the first time or be new to us. And we have had people from other states and countries join us. But you're able to sort of be in the space without coming to the building, right? You don't have to come in and walk in and all of that. You kind of can, and then you can see each other's faces so easily and get to know each other. So I know that it has taken that piece of what we understand church to be and maybe given us an extra way to do that even better as we have hard conversations. And we've had some amazing book studies and pub theology conversations through Zoom that maybe wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So it's sort of expanded that. The other side of the building part is, it's not the building, but it is the building. And so in terms of ecclesiology, for me, sacred space continues to be vitally important. And we have missed that this year. For all of our work on tactile worship and great imagery on our screens and all of those things, there is nothing like walking into a sacred space and knowing it is a space that is safe and a space we can be brave in, and creating that together. And so it has sort of confirmed that for me. So anytime I've read something like, why do we need our church buildings? I go back to that. That is the piece that has been the hardest to create in these online spaces. Now, and it's not that we haven't done some of it. And we do talk about thin spaces at Cairn a lot. And when people are sitting in their homes and there's distractions and there's pets and there's coffee to be drunk and, whatever it is, it's too many distractions. But it's not just about a quiet space, because part of the sacred space is the community being there together. I think about our sanctuary has a big labyrinth on the floor in the center of the sanctuary. And we often have the pews in the round around the labyrinth. And at the beginning of our worship, our children always dance on the labyrinth. And that is how worship opens. They dance on the labyrinth, and then they carry candles to the cairn and place them there. And there is nothing like that celebratory gathering of the church that's very hard to feel when you're online.
Yeah. Embodied space.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Cool. So thinking about moving forward, I've read a number of articles and essays and all about church leaders and of all religious congregations, actually, thinking, what do we want to keep that we learned something important about that we weren't doing before on the other side? What is there some of that kind of learning? Is there some of that kind of planning or thought at Cairn?
Absolutely.
What you want to keep?
Yeah. We have not gone back to in-person worship yet, even though things have changed and are changing rapidly. And one of our reasons is our children, and ensuring they can come back and be with us. So that intergenerational push to be together. But we are also really working on hybrid worship that is not simply streaming. So going back to that issue. So when we go back to in-person worship, we have people worshiping with us from West Virginia, from Washington State, from England, from Ohio, all over. And so when we go back, our goal is to be able to have them present the same way they would be present during a Zoom call, so that they can speak, they can share, they can read scripture, lead worship, and that we can see them as well as them see us. And so that is never going away as far as I know, at least not in the near future. And so that's a huge change for us. I think we will also continue doing classes online because it means that some of our seniors that can't get out at night are now included in things they never could have participated in. Folks that don't drive at night, and as well as leadership. We have not always asked our older folks, or sometimes families with young children, to be in certain leadership positions, especially our seasonal groups that plan worship, because it would be so hard for them to get to the church building. And that's just no longer a limitation. So it opens those things out for us so much.
So a lot of changing the way that meetings might get done, changing who might be involved in a class. And this is something I've read several essays on about what's the difference. We used to think about a congregation as strictly local. I mean, even hear the phrase that's often used, or was in another generation, local church.
Yes, the local church.
Right. And now the local and distant polarization, in a way, has weakened quite a bit, as you described in who now may think about Cairn as, if not their quote church home, as one of the places they feel at home when they're trying to be in church.
And I think it has also meant that there are some folks that worship with us sometimes and worship somewhere else sometimes. So what does that even, Cairn has already sort of ditched the whole idea of membership. And so
right.
What does it mean to be part of Cairn? There are multiple ways to be part of Cairn. And so it expands our community so much further. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I'm looking forward to seeing what thoughtful church leaders and religious congregational leaders such as yourself and the folks you work with are going to do as you move forward. Charisa Hunter-Crump, thank you so much for being with me on Committing Faith in Public today and for the kind of public commitment to faith that Cairn really embodies.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Gary.
This has been Committing Faith in Public, a podcast from the Center for Religion and Public Life at Phillips Theological Seminary. Copyright Phillips Theological Seminary and Gary Peluso-Verdend. The views and opinions expressed during the podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect official positions of Phillips Theological Seminary.